She was just the quiet black nurse on the trauma floor, the one the senior surgeon dismissed without a second thought. Nobody knew her past, nobody asked, and she never offered it. But the night they wheeled in a critically wounded soldier with a sealed military file, he opened his eyes in that operating room, looked past every doctor standing over him, found her face, and whispered a word that no patient had any business saying to a nurse. One word that changed everything. Just before we get back to it, I'd love to know where you're watching from today, and if you're enjoying these stories, make sure you're subscribed. The overnight shift at Mercy General Hospital in Baltimore was never quiet. It was the kind of quiet that wasn't really quiet at all, full of beeping monitors, rubber soles squeaking on polished linoleum, low, urgent voices carrying through corridors that smelled like antiseptic and burnt coffee. Most of the nurses who worked the night trauma floor had learned to tune out the chaos. Naomi Carter had learned something different. She had learned to listen harder. She moved through the ward the way water moves through a narrow channel, without wasted motion, without hesitation, without making a sound that didn't need to be made. She checked vitals on the patient in Bay 4 before the monitor alarmed. She repositioned the 4 drip in Bay 7 before the bag ran out. She noted the subtle change in respiration rate on the elderly man in Bay 2 and flagged it in the chart a full 20 minutes before the attending physician noticed anything at all. Nobody thanked her for any of it. Most nights, nobody noticed. Carter. The voice came from a nurse's station, flat and dismissive. She turned to find Dr. Victor Langford standing with his arms crossed and his reading glasses pushed up on his forehead like a man who had decided long ago that the world owed him its full attention. He was tall, silver-haired, and carried the particular arrogance of someone who had been the smartest person in many rooms and had never once considered the possibility that he wasn't. I need the chart on the patient in Bay 9, not the digitized summary. The physical intake notes. Can you manage that? Already on your workstation, Naomi said. He blinked. I didn't ask you to. You were going to, she said simply, and turned back to her work. The silence that followed lasted exactly 3 seconds before Langford made a sound in the back of his throat and walked away. A younger nurse named Petra, barely 6 months out of school, appeared at Naomi's elbow with wide eyes. He's going to hate you for that, Petra whispered. He already does, Naomi said. It doesn't interfere with the work. That was the thing about Naomi Carter that people couldn't quite figure out. She was not unfriendly. She wasn't cold, exactly. She would answer questions, explain procedures, show younger nurses the correct way to read a wound drainage assessment or spot the early signs of septic shock. But she held herself at a certain distance from the social fabric of the floor. The gossip, the venting, the weekend plans discussed over shared lunches. That made her feel, to most of her colleagues, like someone who existed slightly outside the normal world. Like she was watching it through glass. Staff had been whispering about her since her first week. She'd come from a placement agency. Her references were solid but vague, and she never talked about where she'd worked before. What she did talk about, if you asked directly enough, was the work in front of her. She knew wound patterns the way some people know music instinctively, with a depth that went beyond anything taught in nursing school. She read trauma presentations the way seasoned ER physicians did. She anticipated complications before they became emergencies. Dr. Allison Brooks had been watching her for 3 weeks. Brooks was 34, the youngest attending trauma surgeon on the floor, and she had gotten to her position by paying close attention to things other people dismissed. She had watched Naomi catch a misread EKG that would have resulted in a dangerous medication interaction. She had watched Naomi correctly identify a compartment syndrome presentation that 2 residents had chalked up to normal post-surgical swelling. She had said nothing yet, but she was building a picture, and the picture didn't look like any nurse she'd ever worked with. It was 11:47 when the radio crackle came through from the ambulance bay. 2 incoming traumas, a car accident, and something else. Something that made the dispatcher's voice go careful and deliberate in a way that caught Naomi's attention immediately. Second unit incoming, 23-year-old male, classified training accident, military escort on scene, ETA 4 minutes. Patient is critical. Repeat, critical. The trauma bay erupted into the controlled version of chaos that hospitals rehearsed for. Langford appeared from wherever he'd retreated, pulling on a fresh pair of gloves with the practiced confidence of a man in his element. Residents materialized. Nurses took positions. Naomi was already at the bay doors when the ambulance backed in, and she was one of the first hands on the gurney when they wheeled him through. The man was young, early 30s, maybe. He was large through the chest and shoulders in the particular way that spoke of disciplined physical training maintained over years, not vanity. His face was pale with blood loss, jaw set even in unconsciousness, and there were two military personnel flanking the gurney who wore civilian clothes that fit them badly, the way military clothes on military bodies always look when they're pretending to be something else. The patient's intake paperwork was sealed in a red folder that one of the escorts held against his chest and did not hand to anyone. "What are we working with?" Langford said, moving alongside the gurney. "Blunt abdominal trauma, possible internal hemorrhage, penetrating wound to the left shoulder, secondary lacerations to the forearm, and neck consistent with..." The paramedic began reading from his notes. Naomi was looking at the wounds, not listening to the description of them. Looking. She had seen wounds like these before. Not in a hospital. Not in a training scenario. The pattern of the shoulder entry, the angle of the secondary lacerations, the bruising already blooming across the left side of the rib cage. These were not training injuries. They were not accident injuries. She recognized them the way you recognize the smell of a place you grew up in, deep and certain and impossible to mistake. She kept her face still and said nothing. They transferred him to the trauma table. Langford was calling out orders, the team responding with practiced efficiency. And 4-line went in. A pressure cuff. Naomi moved to her position and worked with the rest of them, her hands doing what they were supposed to do while her mind was running a different calculation entirely. "Pressure is dropping," one of the residents called out. "His abdomen is rigid," Naomi said, keeping her voice level. "The hemorrhage isn't where you're looking. Based on the bruising pattern, there's likely a secondary bleed." "Carter." Langford's voice was sharp. "You are here to assist, not diagnose. Stay in your lane. The bleed pattern on the left." I said stay quiet. He didn't look at her when he said it. He was already ordering an ultrasound card and talking over her like she hadn't spoken. The team moved with him. That was the gravity of a man like Langford. Everything orbited him whether it should or not. Naomi pressed her mouth into a line and did her job. But she watched. She counted. She tracked the rate of pressure drop and mapped it against the ultrasound results that were coming back, and what she was seeing didn't align. The primary bleed they were chasing wasn't accounting for the volume of loss. There was something else. Something the angle of the imaging was missing because of the entry wound's position relative to the table. The patient's pressure crashed. It happened fast. The monitor screaming, two residents talking over each other, Langford snapping orders in that way of his that was confident and wrong in equal measure. And in the 2 seconds of fractured noise and motion, Naomi stepped forward, placed her hand on the correct quadrant of the patient's abdomen, and said clearly and loudly enough to cut through everything. "Ballistic wound track. Subhepatic. You need to pack the right upper quadrant or you'll lose him in the next 90 seconds. Dead silence. Every eye in the room on her. Langford turned slowly, the kind of slow that was its own language. And then the monitor screamed louder, and Brooks said, "Do it." And the team moved. She was right. She was exactly right, down to the quadrant. Langford got control of the bleed, and the patient's pressure stabilized, and nobody said anything about it except through the sideways glances that went around the room like a current. Langford's jaw was a hard line. Brooks was watching Naomi with an expression that was not quite surprise, more like confirmation. They were deep in stabilization, maybe 40 minutes in when it happened. The patient had been unconscious. He should have been unconscious. His sedation levels made it essentially impossible for him to surface. And yet something pulled him up through the dark, some trained instinct that had kept him alive long enough to make it to this table in the first place. And his eyes opened, unfocused at first, blinking against the surgical lights. His gaze moved across the ceiling, moved across the blur of faces above him. And then it found Naomi, standing 3 feet away with her gloves stained and her face still, and her eyes watching him with that particular quality of attention that was not like any other attention he had ever felt from anyone except one person in his entire life. His lips moved. Everyone in the room leaned slightly, involuntarily. "Commander," he whispered. Barely a sound, but the room was very still. "Is that you?" The word landed like something dropped from height. Naomi did not react. Or rather, she reacted the way she had been trained to react, which was to let nothing show on the outside, while everything that was real moved through her like a current she couldn't stop. She looked at him for exactly 1 second, and then looked back at her work. "He's disoriented," she said. Sedation response. "It happens." "That's right," Langford said, recovering quickly, grateful for the explanation. "Confusion under anesthesia. Common. Let's focus." But Brooks was not looking at the patient. She was looking at Naomi's hands. Because in the moment the man had said that word, "Commander," Naomi's hands had stopped for exactly 1 full second before resuming their work. Brooks had counted. 1 second of perfect stillness in a woman who never stopped moving. The patient went under again. The surgery continued. They stabilized him, closed what needed closing, prepared him for the ICU. People cycled in and out of the bay the way they always did, the rhythm of the trauma floor reasserting itself over the strangeness of the previous hour. By the time the patient was being moved, the staff had mostly decided the same thing Langford had decided: delirious trauma patient, mistake, nothing. Brooks had decided nothing of the sort. She found Naomi at the scrub sink afterward, washing her hands with that methodical thoroughness she brought to everything, and stood beside her without saying anything for a moment. "You knew where the bleed was?" Brooks said finally. "I made a clinical observation." "You knew before the ultrasound showed anything." "You were ahead of the imaging by about 30 seconds. Naomi dried her hands. "The bruising pattern was consistent with." "I know what the bruising pattern was consistent with. I'm a trauma surgeon." Brooks kept her voice even, conversational. "That wasn't nursing school, Naomi. That was something else." Naomi looked at her. "He's stable. That's what matters." She folded the paper towel neatly and dropped it in the waste bin and walked back to the floor. Brooks stood at the sink for another few seconds, thinking about a man whispering the word "commander" to a trauma nurse in the middle of a surgical intervention. She was not going to let this go. The gossip started before the night shift was even over. By the time the first gray light of a Baltimore morning was pressing against the hospital's high windows, the story had already mutated through at least 4 versions. In the most popular version, the patient had confused Naomi with a nurse he remembered from a previous hospitalization. In another version, he'd been calling out for someone named Amanda or Cameron, something that sounded like commander to ears that were straining in a noisy, or there was a third version, circulating mostly among the residents, that involved the suggestion that Naomi had treated the man before and hadn't disclosed it. None of these versions satisfied Dr. Allison Brooks. She sat in the small office she shared with 2 other attendings, her coffee going cold beside her, and pulled up the limited patient intake information on her screen. The red folder hadn't been surrendered. The military escorts had taken it back with them when the patient moved to the ICU. What the hospital system did have was a partial intake form, enough to confirm what the paramedics' radio call had started to suggest. The patient's name, released through official military hospital liaison protocol, was Lieutenant Jake Thornton, United States Navy. The file listed him as highly decorated, active duty, unit designation classified. The words "classified training accident" were in the intake notes, typed precisely, and Allison had been working in trauma medicine long enough to know exactly what that phrase was designed to do. She wrote the name down. Jake Thornton. She looked at it for a while. Down the hall, Naomi Carter was pretending to update charts. She sat at the nurse's station with her reading glasses on and the screen in front of her, and her hands doing the right things, and none of it mattered because the only thing inside her head at that moment was a name. She had heard it from one of the ICU nurses who'd passed by the station 10 minutes ago, half-whispered with the relish of someone carrying interesting information. "Did you hear the military patient? It's Jake Thornton, Navy SEAL. They're keeping his room restricted." And by the time the sentence was finished, Naomi had already felt the shift happen somewhere deep in her chest, the way the ground shifts in a small earthquake. You feel it before you understand it. Jake Thornton. She pushed her glasses up and stared at the screen and did not see a single word on it. She stood up quietly, told the charge nurse she was taking a 10-minute break, and walked to the end of the hall where a window looked out over the parking structure. She stood there with her arms crossed and the city laid out below her in its morning gray and let herself, for just a moment, go back. She had been 31 years old when she made commander, the youngest in her unit's history by 4 years, and a black woman in a space that still had to be argued into existence every time someone new arrived. She had learned early that she would not be given the benefit of the doubt that her white male counterparts received as a matter of routine. She had learned to be twice as precise, twice as calm, and to let her results do the talking that she was never quite given the room to do herself. Her unit had been small and elite, and there's in the way that only close-quarter service creates. A loyalty built not from sentiment, but from the specific knowledge that the person beside you had already made a choice, in a real moment, to protect your life at cost to their own. She had earned that loyalty. She had given it freely in return. Jake Thornton had arrived as the youngest member of the team, 23 years old and burning with the energy of someone who had trained his whole life for exactly this and couldn't quite believe he'd made it. He was talented, genuinely, uncomfortably talented in the way that some people simply are. Fast reflexes, exceptional spatial awareness, a natural instinct for tactical reading that most operators spent a decade developing. He was also reckless with it, the way young men with real gifts often are, because ability had not yet taught him the full weight of its cost. Naomi had seen it right away. She'd assigned him to the position in the unit that gave him the least room to improvise and the most structured oversight, and she made sure she knew where he was on every operation. Not because she didn't trust him, because she trusted what she saw in him too much to let it get him killed before he learned to carry it properly. She became his commander and, in the complicated way that small units work, something closer to an older sister. She didn't allow sentiment in the field, but she was aware of him in the way a pilot is aware of the most promising student they've ever taught, watching for the moment when the ability will outpace the ego, hoping to be there when it does. They ran 9 operations together, 9 successful operations in conditions that range from difficult to almost unsurvivable, and Naomi had brought every one of her people home. The 10th mission was different. She had known it going in, not a premonition, nothing that could be called intuition exactly, but a reading of the intelligence that didn't sit right. The sourcing was clean on paper. The tactical picture was solid, but something in the spacing of the information, the way it all aligned a little too perfectly, had scratched at the back of her mind in the days leading up to deployment. She'd flagged her concerns through official channels. She'd been told the intelligence was verified. They deployed on a Tuesday night. By Wednesday morning, for members of her team were dead. The location had been compromised before they arrived. Someone had known. Someone had made sure that when Naomi's unit reached the objective, there would be people waiting for them. She had gotten the survivors out, Jake among them, badly shaken, carrying a wound to his shoulder that he would have the scar from for the rest of his life. And she had brought them home. And then the reports had started, and the inquiry, and the language that investigations use when they have already decided what they need to find. Operational Commander failed to adequately assess intelligence risk. The mission failure is attributed to command-level decision-making. She had resigned rather than watch her surviving soldiers pulled through an inquiry designed to produce a predetermined verdict. If someone needed to carry this, she would carry it. She was the commander. That was what the rank meant. She had left the Navy on a Tuesday, 7 years ago, and she had not spoken about any of it since. Naomi came back to herself at the window. The parking structure was filling up with the day's shift arriving. She looked at her own reflection in the glass for a moment. The scrubs, the lanyard, the reading glasses pushed up on her forehead, and then she turned and walked back to the nurse's station. She was halfway through the charting she hadn't finished when the call came through from the ICU charge nurse. The military patient in restricted room 4 was beginning to surface from sedation. Family contact had been requested, but was unavailable. Nursing staff check requested. Naomi looked at the assignment board. The ICU was not her floor. She was not assigned a room for. She went anyway. The room smelled like antiseptic and the particular staleness of forced air recycling through a sealed space. Jake was lying in the bed with monitors on 3 sides of him and a saline drip in his right arm, and he looked, to someone who didn't know him, like a man simply unconscious. To Naomi, standing in the doorway, he looked like Jake Thornton at 23 years old who had just survived something that should have killed him, because she had seen him in exactly that condition before, and the picture was uncomfortably familiar. She walked to the bedside. She checked the monitors out of professional habit, looked at the drainage readings, noted the vital signs. Stable. He had made it through the night. She was reaching for his chart when he opened his eyes. He didn't surface gradually the way most patients did. The slow blinking, the confusion, the gradual assembly of context. His eyes opened, and they were immediately fully aware. He stared at the ceiling for 2 seconds. Then his head turned, and he looked at her. His expression did several things in rapid succession. The first was pure shock. The second was something that looked like relief and pain arriving simultaneously. The third settled into a careful, wary stillness that she recognized from the field, the expression of a man who is assessing whether the situation is safe. "You shouldn't be here," he said. His voice was rough from the intubation, barely above a whisper, but the words were precise. "Commander, I'm a nurse," she said quietly. "I work in this hospital. I know what you are." His eyes didn't leave her face. "And I know what you were. Those are 2 different things." She pulled the chair beside the bed closer and sat down. Outside the room's glass partition, the ICU corridor was quiet. She leaned forward slightly. "How bad is it?" she asked. Not his injuries. He knew what she meant. His jaw tightened. He looked at the ceiling briefly, then back at her. "Bad enough that I ended up here instead of where I was supposed to be." "What happened?" "Same thing that always happens." His voice was barely audible. "Somebody knew. Somebody always knows." She held very still. "They're still watching," he said. The words came out flat and deliberate, a man spending his energy carefully. "Whatever you think happened after you left, it didn't stop. It kept going. And right now," he stopped. His breathing was controlled but effortful. "Right now they know I'm not dead." Naomi looked at the door. The corridor was still quiet. She looked back at him. "Jake." Her voice was steady. It had always been steady, even when nothing else was. "You need to rest." "Wheel." "There's no time for rest." His hand moved toward her slightly, the gesture of a man who couldn't reach but needed to be heard. "Naomi, I found something. I was close. That's why this happened." He blinked, fighting the sedation pulling at him. "You have to understand what's still." His eyes closed. She waited. His breathing evened out into the rhythm of unconscious sleep. She sat with him for another 30 seconds, watching the monitors, watching the rise and fall of his chest. Then she stood, straightened the chair back to its position, and walked out of the room. In the corridor, she paused with her back against the wall beside the door and looked at the far end of the hallway and felt something rearrange itself inside her, a kind of realignment like tumblers in a lock that has been waiting a long time to be turned. They're still watching. She had spent 7 years being a trauma nurse in Baltimore. She had been very good at it. She had found, in the precision of the work, something that resembled the precision of command without the weight of what had come after. She had built, carefully and quietly, a life that did not require her to think about the mission that had taken 4 of her people. Jake Thornton had been carried through her ER doors last night, and in the space of 12 hours, he had said 2 things to her, each one a door she had spent years keeping shut. Whatever had destroyed their team years ago was not finished. She pushed off the wall and walked back toward the trauma floor, and her footsteps were quiet and even, and her face showed nothing. But behind her eyes, something old and precise and disciplined had begun to wake up, blinking in the light like a soldier being called back from leave. The war had found her. It always found the people who were good at it. It started with the sound of boots, not the soft-soled footsteps of hospital staff or the measured pace of administrators making rounds. These were hard-heeled, deliberate, moving in the kind of formation that people who have spent years in coordinated movement fall into without thinking. Naomi heard them from the trauma floor before she saw anything, and she stopped what she was doing and listened the way she had trained herself to listen, not just to the sound but to what the sound meant. She set down the medication tray she was carrying and walked to the hallway. There were 6 of them, 4 in military-adjacent civilian clothing that did the same poor job of concealing their background as the escort from the night before. 2 in actual uniform. They moved through the hospital's main corridor with the quiet authority of people who were not asking for permission to be there, and staff stepped aside for them instinctively, the way people step aside for something large and certain of its direction. Behind them came a hospital administrator who looked like he was trying very hard to appear cooperative while also being terrified. Security personnel trailed at a respectful distance. Within minutes of their arrival, Naomi could see the effect rippling outward through the building. Nurses clustering in doorways, residents craning their necks. The particular hush that falls over a place when something has entered it that is larger than its usual concerns. The ICU wing went into effective lockdown within the hour. Not announced, not formal, just the quiet repositioning of personnel and the appearance of a checkpoint at the hallway entrance that hadn't been there that morning. Jake's room was now accessible only with military clearance, and the 2 guards stationed outside, it were not hospital security. Naomi watched all of this from a distance. She made herself continue her shift. She answered questions, completed documentation, checked on patients. She was very good at making herself appear to be doing exactly one thing when she was actually doing another. She was in the medication preparation room when she heard his voice. She recognized it before she placed it, a quality of command in the cadence that her nervous system registered the way it registers familiar music. She stepped to the doorway and looked down the hall. Chief Mason Riley was standing at the nurse's station. He was 38 years old, built like someone had assembled him specifically for difficult terrain, and he wore the kind of face that had been weathered by things that don't make it into official reports. He was speaking to the charge nurse in the measured, controlled tone of a man accustomed to getting information efficiently. The charge nurse was nodding and pointing toward the ICU corridor. Then Riley turned. His eyes swept the hallway in the automatic threat assessment pattern that every operator developed and never fully lost. Left to right, near to far, movement prioritized, and they found Naomi standing in the doorway of the medication room 30 feet away. He went completely still. For a moment, they simply looked at each other across the length of the hallway, and the noise of the hospital floor seemed to recede to a great distance. Riley's expression moved through several things very quickly. Shock, then something raw and unguarded, then a kind of relief so profound it briefly unmade the hard lines of his face. He crossed the distance between them in 8 steps. He stopped 2 feet in front of her. And then Chief Mason Riley, decorated SEAL team leader with 11 years of active special operations service, stood straight and brought his hand to his forehead in a clean, formal salute. The effect on the hallway was immediate. 3 nurses stopped moving entirely. A resident walking past paused mid-stride. Dr. Victor Langford, who had arrived from some other part of the floor and was now standing near the nurse's station reviewing charts, looked up from his papers with an expression of pure disorientation. The expression of a man who has walked into a room where the furniture has been rearranged in the dark. "Commander Carter," Riley said. His voice was steady, but she could hear what was underneath it. "I didn't know you were here." "I work here," she said. "Put your hand down, Mason." He lowered the salute slowly. He did not look away from her. "How long?" he asked. 4 years at this hospital. 3 before that at a clinic in D.C. She kept her voice low, professional. "I'm a trauma nurse. That's what I am now." "You were the one in the ER last night," he said. It wasn't a question. "I was part of the surgical team. Jake is alive because of that." He said it simply, without decoration. Naomi glanced down the hallway. Langford was still watching them. So were the nurses. So was everyone who had a sight line to this particular stretch of corridor. "This isn't the place," she said quietly. "No," Riley agreed. "But I need you to know something before we do this anywhere. Whatever you think your role is right now," he held her gaze, "you're the reason half the people I've served with came home. And there isn't a man on my current team who doesn't know that." She looked at him for a moment. Then she said, "Walk with me." Langford stopped them before they made it 3 steps. He had detached himself from the nurse's station and was moving toward them with the energy of a man who had decided something needed to be addressed. "I'm sorry," he said, looking at Riley. "I don't know who cleared you to be in this section of the hospital, but I need to understand what's happening with the patient in ICU Restricted 4. He's my patient, and—" "He was your patient," Riley said pleasantly. "He's now under military medical jurisdiction. We appreciate the work your team did last night." He paused, particularly Nurse Carter. Without her intervention, Lieutenant Thornton would not have survived the surgical stabilization. Langford's expression went through a complicated journey. He looked at Naomi, then at Riley, then at the salute he had just witnessed, but couldn't quite reconcile with the woman standing in front of him in hospital scrubs. "She's a nurse," he said. The words came out less certain than he intended. "Yes," Riley said. "She is. She's also the reason half of my team is alive to walk through your hospital today." He let that sit for exactly 2 seconds. "If you have medical concerns about Lieutenant Thornton's care going forward, my medical officer will be the point of contact." "Thank you, Doctor." He turned away from Langford with the efficiency of a man closing a door. Langford stood there. For the first time in the years Naomi had worked at Mercy General, she watched Dr. Victor Langford have absolutely nothing to say. She and Riley found a family consultation room at the end of the East Wing, small, private, with a window overlooking a courtyard that nobody used in February. She closed the door. They stood on opposite sides of a small table, and for a moment neither of them spoke, which was its own kind of conversation. "Tell me about the mission," she said. Riley leaned forward with his forearms on the table. Jake was tracking a network. Black market arms, not street level, not cartel. Military-grade hardware, contract-sourced, moving through procurement channels that should have been clean. Naomi was quiet. "He'd been embedded for 7 months, Riley continued. "He was close. Whatever he found in the final 3 weeks was significant enough that someone decided to cut the operation short." He looked at his hands. "We lost 2 men in the extraction. Jake got out because he's Jake. But it was close." "How close was the intelligence breach?" Riley looked up at her. The question landed the way she'd intended it to, not as an accusation, but as a signal. A signal that she was already thinking the way she had always thought, that the shape of what he was describing was not new to her. "Close enough to be internal," he said carefully. "It was internal 7 years ago," she said. The room was very quiet. "I know," Riley said. "Then you understand what I'm thinking." "I've been thinking it since we pulled Jake out of that water." He straightened up. "Naomi." He said a name before we got him to the ambulance. He was barely conscious. He was losing blood faster than we could manage, but he was clear enough to say a name. "I've been carrying it since the extraction." Naomi held very still. "Whose name?" Riley opened his mouth to answer. The door to the consultation room opened. It was Brooks. She stood in the doorway, looking at both of them with the expression of someone who has followed a trail of evidence to a conclusion they weren't entirely prepared for. She looked at Naomi. She looked at the military officer sitting across from her. She looked at the quality of their conversation, the posture, the seriousness, the particular gravity of 2 people discussing something that mattered enormously. "I need to be in this room," Brooks said. Naomi looked at her. "Dr. Brooks." "Naomi." Brooks kept her voice quiet and direct. "I've been watching you for 3 weeks. Last night, I watched you locate a subhepatic bleed through clinical pattern recognition that our imaging missed. I watched a decorated military officer salute you in the hallway. And I just pulled Lieutenant Thornton's partial file, which has 3 levels of classification on a document that a trauma hospital should never have received at all." She stepped inside and closed the door behind her. "Whatever is happening in this building, it isn't finished. And you need someone here who can help you and who has hospital access you don't." Riley looked at Naomi. The look said, "Your call." Naomi studied Brooks for a moment. Then she said, "Sit down." She gave Brooks the minimum necessary. Jake's connection to her past, the classified nature of his mission, the suggestion that the attack had been a deliberate inside operation. She said nothing about the name Riley had been about to share. That could wait until she understood how far the inside extended. Brooks listened without interrupting. When Naomi finished, Brooks sat back in her chair and said, "Someone accessed his medical chart this morning. Both Naomi and Riley looked at her. I checked the system logs 20 minutes ago, Brooks said. Jake Thornton's file was pulled at 6:43 a.m. The access credential belongs to a radiology technician named Paul Wheeler. Wheeler clocked in at 7:15 this morning. She paused. He was in the building at 6:43. The silence in the room had a different texture now. Someone used his credentials, Naomi said. Yes. And the chart. Accessed. Portion of his intake notes downloaded. The download location traces to a terminal in the basement supply corridor. Brooks looked at her steadily. Nobody has reason to be in that corridor at 6 in the morning. It's medical supply storage. Naomi was already standing. The basement supply corridor was a long, fluorescent-lit channel that ran the length of the hospital's original building, lined on both sides with shelving units and rolling carts and the general industrial background of a working medical facility. It smelled like rubber and cardboard and cleaning solution. At 6 in the evening, with the day shift winding down and the night shift not yet fully populated, it was empty except for the hum of the overhead lights. Naomi walked through it slowly, reading the space the way she had been taught to read unfamiliar terrain, looking for what didn't belong, what was slightly wrong, what had been moved or disturbed. She found the terminal in question. A standalone workstation mounted to the wall near the fire door at the corridor's midpoint, used for inventory logging. The screen was dark. She looked at the floor around it, the shelf beside it, the fire door itself. The fire door had a thin strip of black adhesive tape pressed across the latch mechanism. Small, easy to miss if you weren't looking. If you pressed the door open from outside with the latch taped, it wouldn't catch. It could be pushed open from outside without triggering the alarm. Someone had prepared an exit route. She pulled out her phone and photographed the tape without touching it. As she walked back upstairs, she reported what she found to Riley. He reported it through channels she wasn't fully aware of. By 9 that evening, hospital security was quietly reviewing every entry and exit log from the past 24 hours, and 2 of Riley's people were walking the perimeter. It should have been enough for one night. It wasn't. At 11:20, Naomi was at the nurse's station completing documentation when one of Riley's personnel, a young man who introduced himself only as Warren, appeared at her elbow and said, very quietly, "Someone's trying to access the ICU corridor. Not military, not staff. They got a lab coat and a fake badge, but the badge number doesn't match anyone in the system. They're at the checkpoint now." Naomi was on her feet before he finished the sentence. She moved through the corridor at a pace that was fast without looking like it was fast, the walk of a nurse responding to something, which was unremarkable in a hospital at any hour. She came around the corner of the ICU hallway in time to see a figure in a white lab coat at the checkpoint, speaking with the guard, holding out an ID badge with the ease of someone who had done this kind of thing before. Medium height, dark hair, the posture of calm. The guard was checking the badge number against his list. Naomi could see from the guard's expression that something wasn't matching. She walked toward them with purpose. The figure in the lab coat sensed movement and turned slightly, and in the fraction of a second before the person controlled their expression, Naomi saw the calculation happen behind their eyes. Saw them assess her, assess the guard, assess the distance to the corridor's far exit. "Dr. Mitchell," Naomi said clearly, using a name that meant nothing, a decoy. "Dr. Langford is looking for you. He needs the overnight labs for the patient in room 6. The figure looked at her, a beat of hesitation, and then they moved, not toward Langford, not toward room 6, but toward the corridor's far exit, fast and decisive, the controlled sprint of someone trained for exactly this kind of exit. "Stop," Naomi said. The word came out in a voice she had not used in 7 years. The voice that had once moved 30-person units through hostile terrain on a whisper. It carried. The figure didn't stop. But Warren appeared at the far end of the corridor, and 2 of Riley's people materialized from across hallway, and the figure pulled up short, trapped between pursuit and obstacle with nowhere useful to go. In the commotion that followed, brief, controlled, loud enough to bring 3 nurses and a bewildered resident running, the figure managed to twist through a gap and push through the fire stairwell door. By the time anyone made it through after them, the stairwell was empty. One person gone, but not without leaving something behind. A cell phone, dropped in the scramble, sliding under the baseboard near the stairwell door. Warren bagged it without touching the screen. Naomi stood in the empty stairwell for a moment with her hand on the door frame, listening to the building around her, thinking about what had just been attempted. Someone had come to Jake's room tonight. Not to retrieve him, not to move him. If they'd wanted to move him, they would have come with paperwork and muscle. This was one person with a fake badge and a practice comm. One person came in to make sure a wounded man did not leave that room alive. She pushed back through the door and walked back to the ICU hallway and looked at the guard station outside Jake's room. And she thought about hospital corridors and fake credentials and how many more people might be in this building right now who were not what they appeared to be. The hospital was compromised. She was certain of it. Naomi did not sleep that night. She stayed at the hospital through her shift's end and then stayed beyond it. Sitting in the family consultation room with a cup of coffee she didn't drink and a yellow legal pad, she filled slowly with notes in the precise, compressed handwriting she had used for mission documentation years ago. She wrote down everything she knew, everything she suspected. The shape of it, arranged on the page, was worse than she had allowed herself to feel while she was moving through it. By 4 a.m, she had 3 columns. What she knew, what she could prove, what was still missing. The third column was longest. Riley arrived at 5:30, looking like a man who had also not slept, but was accustomed to functioning in that condition. He had a folder under his arm. He sat down across from her without ceremony. "Security footage from the basement corridor," he said. "From last night and from this morning." "Gone," she said. "Not deleted. Overwritten." He opened the folder. Whoever did it used the hospital's own maintenance protocol for scheduled recording cycles. It looks like a system function. If you don't know what you're looking for, you don't flag it. This wasn't opportunistic, Naomi said. They had someone in the system before Jake arrived. They were ready for him, which means they knew he was coming here before he did. She looked at him, which means they knew about the mission before it finished. The word betrayal sat between them without either of them saying it. Brooks appeared at 7:15, earlier than her shift required, carrying her own coffee and looking like someone who had made a decision she was now committed to. She closed the door behind her, sat down, and said, "I need to know what I'm actually involved in. All of it." Naomi studied her for a moment. "Why?" "Because last night someone tried to access a critically wounded patient's room with a forged hospital credential, and the security footage that should show who it was has been scrubbed." Brooks kept her voice even. "I've been a trauma surgeon for 6 years. I know what a normal complicated shift looks like, and I know what this looks like. These are different things." She looked at Naomi directly. "You need someone who knows this hospital. You need me." Naomi looked at Riley. He gave her the small nod that meant, "Your call, same as before." She told Brooks everything. Not the pieces she'd shared the day before. Everything. Jake's mission, the arms network, the internal breach that had allowed last night's infiltration. The pattern she was seeing that connected to the mission that had destroyed her unit 7 years ago. She kept her voice flat and informational. She was a commander briefing an asset who needed full situational awareness to be useful. Brooks listened without the expression of someone being shocked. She listened like someone fitting pieces into a picture she had already partially assembled. "Black market arms through military procurement," Brooks said when Naomi finished. "That's not a small operation. That's years. That's infrastructure. It's been running for at least 8 years, Naomi said. Probably longer. The mission that cost me 4 soldiers was the first time anyone got close enough to threaten it. They shut us down before we could pull anything useful. And Jake's mission, he got closer. Close enough that they decided the mission had to end." She paused. "Close enough that he got a name." Brooks looked at her. "Whose name?" Naomi looked at Riley. He had been waiting for this moment. She could see it, the slight tightening around his eyes of a man about to say something that cannot be unsaid. "I need Jake Conscious to confirm it," Riley said. But in the extraction, just before we got him on the transport, he said it clearly, twice. He looked at Naomi. "Admiral Robert Hayes." The name landed in the room the way physical things land. With weight. With the particular gravity of something that was real. Naomi sat with it for 3 full seconds. She knew Robert Hayes. She had known him when he was a captain and she was a lieutenant commander, when their paths had crossed through joint operations briefings and mission authorization channels. She had respected him. He had been, in the part of her professional life that she tried to think about as little as possible, one of the people she had trusted. "Hey," she said. Her voice was perfectly steady. "It matches," Riley said quietly. The procurement channels Jake traced run through divisions Hayes has had oversight of for the past decade. The authorization signatures on the contract that were flagged, they're buried under 12 layers of bureaucratic cover, but they point to the same authority level. He leaned forward. "Naomi, Hayes was in the oversight chain for your mission 7 years ago. He had access to your intelligence sources. He would have known your deployment timeline. She had known this was coming. She had felt the shape of it from the moment Jake had whispered they're still watching in the ICU. And still, hearing it said plainly, she felt something shift in her chest. Not surprise, but the particular cold weight of confirmation. She had taken the blame for a mission that had been sabotaged by someone she trusted. 4 of her people had died for someone else's money. "Where's Hayes now?" she asked. "DC," Riley said. "He's been informed that Jake survived. My contact at command says Hayes personally requested to coordinate the retrieval." "Retrieval," Brooks said. "You mean?" "He's sending investigators," Riley said. "Officially, to secure Jake's testimony about the mission. Protocol, paperwork above board." He looked at Naomi. "But given what happened last night, given the footage that got scrubbed, given the infiltrator who walked in with a forged badge, they're not coming to protect him," Naomi said. "No." She stood up. She walked to the window. The courtyard below was starting to catch the early morning light, February thin and gray. She looked at it for a moment without seeing it, and she thought about 4 people whose names she could say in her sleep, and she thought about 7 years of carrying something that had never been hers to carry. She turned back to the room. How long before Hayes' people arrive? Riley checked his watch. Transport left DC at 6. Depending on how they're moving, 5 hours. Maybe 4. Then we have 4 hours to get Jake out of this building. Brooks straightened. Riley nodded once. The nod of a soldier who has been waiting for the order that just arrived. "We need a route that doesn't flag in the hospital's official transfer logs," Naomi continued. "We need transport that doesn't match any vehicle registered to military liaison. And we need Jake stable enough to move without the move killing him." She looked at Brooks. "Can you manage his medical condition during a non-standard transfer?" "Yes," Brooks said without hesitation. "Good." Naomi looked at Riley. "What do you have in terms of personnel you trust completely?" 4, he said. "Here now, already in the building. Then here's what we're going to do." She pulled the legal pad toward her and began writing. Her handwriting was the same as it had always been, precise, compressed, every word in its right place. The plan took shape on the page with the efficiency of something her hands remembered how to build. Riley watched her. His expression was not one she could easily describe, somewhere between relief and recognition, like watching something that had been away for a long time finally walk back through the door. Jake regained consciousness at 8:47 a.m. Naomi was in the room when it happened, having cleared a medical check with the guard outside through a paperwork process Riley had quietly arranged. She was standing at the bedside when Jake's eyes opened, and this time his surfacing was slower, less the snapping awake of the night before, more the careful emergence of a man who had learned to ration his strength. He looked at the ceiling, then at her. "You're still here," he said. "Still here." His eyes moved around the room. "Processed. Assessed. Riley, outside. He'll be in shortly." Jake turned his head slowly to look at the window. The light was the same thin February gray. He was quiet for a moment, and she could see him assembling himself, putting the pieces of the situation back into order the way trained people do, not allowing themselves the luxury of disorientation. "They came for me last night," he said. "Not a question. One person, fake credentials, got as far as the ICU checkpoint before we intercepted. Got away. Left the phone." Jake closed his eyes briefly. "Hayes doesn't leave loose ends. If one person got away, there'll be more coming." "We know," she said. "Jake, Riley told me the name you gave him. In the extraction," he looked at her. His eyes were steady, the eyes of a man who had made his peace with what he was carrying. Then you know why none of this stops until he's done. Yes. He ordered the sabotage 7 years ago, Jake said. His voice was quiet but absolute. Naomi, I found the documentation. The authorization chain, the asset payments, the intelligence rerouting that let the opposing force know your team's location. It's all on a drive. He stopped. His jaw tightened. The drive that went missing in the extraction. She was silent. My point, man, Harris. He grabbed it when the ambush started. He knew what it was. He knew if Hayes found out we had it, every one of us was dead regardless of whether we made it out. Jake's voice was carefully controlled, but she could hear the weight behind it. Harris didn't make it out, but he was smart, and he was fast, and I don't think he had the drive on him when he went down. You think he hid it? I think he hid it. And I think if it still exists, if anyone found it and left it alone because they didn't know what it was, it's at the site of the extraction. The compound. Naomi thought about that. About a drive full of evidence, sitting in an abandoned coastal facility. About Hayes people already in transit. About the tightening window between now and the moment Jake's room will be visited by people with official federal authorization and an unofficial order. She leaned forward slightly. We're moving you in 3 hours. Before Hayes people arrive. Can you tell me everything you remember about the compound? Jake looked at her. This nurse who had been his commander, this woman who had taken the blame for something she didn't do and had gone on living with it in silence for 7 years. And his expression held something she recognized as guilt and gratitude and a kind of old, stubborn loyalty. I can tell you everything, he said. She pulled out the legal pad. He started talking. Outside the window, the morning moved forward. Somewhere south of the city, a convoy was on the road. At a hospital terminal in the basement, forensic technicians were examining a cell phone that had no fingerprints and a contact list of numbers with no names attached. Naomi wrote down every word Jake said, and her mind was already 3 steps ahead, running the route, assessing the variables, calculating what they would need and what they would have to improvise and what the margin for error was. The margin was thin. It always was. Her old commander voice had come back full and clear, and she was already using it inside her own head, which was the only place it had ever truly lived. She was going to get Jake Thornton out of this building, and then she was going to retrieve that drive. And then 7 years of silence was going to end. The plan had 3 layers, and each one depended on the one beneath it holding firm. Naomi explained it to Riley and Brooks in the family consultation room with the door locked and the legal pad between them. Her voice was low and methodical, and she did not use any words that weren't necessary. This was how she had always briefed, not performing confidence, just carrying it, the way a structural beam carries weight without announcing itself. The first layer was paperwork. Brooks would generate a routine internal transfer order for a patient listed under a placeholder name, moving from ICU to a lower acuity floor for what the documentation would describe as step-down monitoring. Unremarkable. The kind of order that moved through a hospital system a dozen times a day without anyone looking twice. The placeholder name would be processed by the system as a genuine patient because Brooks had the access level to create it, and by the time anyone cross-referenced it against the admission database, they would already be gone. The second layer was personnel. Riley's 4 people would not be in uniform. They would move through the hospital in the clothing of orderlies and transport staff, and they would accompany the gurney through the service corridor on the east wing. Not the main corridor, not the route that passed the checkpoint that Hayes' advanced people might already have eyes on. The service corridor ran to the ambulance loading dock on the building's south side, away from the main entrance where official vehicles would approach. The third layer was the vehicle, not an ambulance. Ambulances were logged, tracked, dispatched through a dispatch system that generated records. Riley had arranged a plain cargo van fitted with basic medical equipment, registered to a private transport company that existed in the state database, but had no operational footprint. The kind of shell that could be assembled quickly by people who knew how to assemble such things. The vehicle gets us 40 minutes before anyone officially notices a problem, Naomi said. That's assuming the fake transfer holds through 2 system checks and nobody physically verifies the room before we clear the building. I can buy you another 20 minutes on top of that, Brooks said. She had a pen in her hand and was turning it slowly, end over end. The gesture of someone thinking fast and keeping their hands busy. The ICU charge nurse rotation changes at 11. If I'm the one who does the handoff briefing for the restricted ward, I can run long on it. Nobody questions an attending surgeon who wants to be thorough. Riley looked at Naomi. That puts us at the dock by 11:40 at the latest, which gives us a 90-minute window before Hayes' transport is scheduled to arrive. Naomi looked at the legal pad. It's workable. What about Jake's condition? Brooks asked. Medically, he lost significant blood volume 2 nights ago. He's 2 days out of major surgery, and we're talking about moving him through a service corridor in a non-clinical vehicle. I'll manage his condition during transit, Naomi said. I need a portable monitor, 2 units of packed cells and a cooler, a crash kit, and a 4-pole that collapses. She looked at Brooks directly. Can you get those to the service corridor without generating a requisition flag? I can pull from the trauma supply cabinet. My access code. Brooks paused. It'll show in the logs eventually. Eventually is fine, Naomi said. Eventually is after we're gone. They ran the plan twice more verbally, stress testing each layer, looking for the place where it came apart. It held. Not perfectly. Nothing this improvised was ever perfect, but it held well enough. Naomi had run operations in worse conditions with less preparation, and those had come home. The ones that hadn't come home had failed for reasons that had nothing to do with the plan. She did not let herself think about that. At 10:58, Naomi walked into Jake's room with the expression of a nurse conducting an ordinary check and the internal state of a commander at the edge of execution. Jake was awake. He had been awake, she suspected, for a while. He had the quality of alert stillness that people develop when they have learned that appearing to be asleep is a survivable strategy. When she entered, he opened his eyes fully and looked at her, and she gave him one small, deliberate nod. His jaw set. He understood. This is going to hurt, she said quietly, beginning to prepare his lines for transport. I need you not to make noise about it. I've had worse, he said. I know. I was there for some of it. She worked quickly and carefully, hands moving through the preparation with the efficiency of someone who had done this in far more difficult circumstances, in the field in the dark, with incoming fire at distances that she still sometimes heard in her sleep. When we move, you keep your breathing steady, and you tell me immediately if you feel a pressure change in the left side. Don't wait. Don't decide it's fine. Tell me. Understood. Riley's people are going to look like hospital staff. Don't react to their faces. She secured the last line. The corridor we're taking is going to be cold. The dock is colder. I need you conscious through all of it. I'll stay conscious. She looked at him. I know you will. At 11:03, Brooks began the extended handoff briefing at the charge nurse station. Her voice was measured and detailed and entirely believable because everything she was saying was medically accurate. She had simply chosen the most time-consuming, accurate things to say. The night charge nurse took notes and asked no questions because Dr. Brooks was the attending, and attending physicians did not get questioned on their thoroughness. At 11:11, Riley's 4 people moved through the East Wing service corridor in pairs, 2 minutes apart. They moved at the pace of people who belonged there, carrying the portable equipment Brooks had pulled from the trauma supply cabinet. Nobody stopped them. Nobody looked twice. A hospital at 11 in the evening is a place of reduced attention and elevated fatigue, and people dressed for a role in a place where that role makes sense are almost never challenged. At 11:19, the gurney moved. Naomi and Riley walked on either side of it. The corridor was long and low-lit and smelled like the industrial underside of the building, cleaning chemicals, old concrete, the faint metallic note of recycled air. Their footsteps were quiet. The gurney's wheels needed oil and made a soft, rhythmic sound against the floor that Naomi focused on as a metronome, counting the seconds, tracking the distance. Jake kept his eyes on the ceiling and his breathing even. His color was not good, but his vitals, on the portable monitor clipped to the gurney rail, were holding inside the range she needed them to hold. They were 30 feet from the dock door when it happened. The door at the far end of the corridor, the one that connected to the hospital's main east wing, opened. 2 men came through it walking fast, wearing the particular confident stride of people who were not here by accident and were not interested in being redirected. The first was in a dark suit. The second was in military-adjacent civilian clothing that Naomi recognized immediately as the same category as the escort from 2 nights ago. They saw the gurney. They saw Naomi. They stopped. Naomi kept walking. She did not change her pace or her expression. She angled the gurney slightly to the right, giving them what looked like a reasonable path to pass on the left. And she kept her eyes on the dock door ahead of her and said to Riley in a voice pitched only for him, "Now." Riley moved, not toward the men, diagonal, cutting off the angle that would have given them a clear view of Jake's face, his body positioning itself between the men and the gurney in the fluid, practiced way of someone who has spent years managing space and bodies under pressure. He said something to them. She couldn't hear it from here, something professional and misdirecting. And the two men paused, looking at him, the half-second of social friction that bought her the time she needed. She pushed through the dock door. The ambulance bay was cold and smelled like exhaust and wet concrete. The van was where it was supposed to be, backed up to the dock with its rear doors open. Two of Riley's people were waiting. She moved Jake from the gurney to the van's interior with the practiced efficiency of a field medic, the transfer smooth and fast and careful. And then she was inside with him, and the doors were closing, and she heard, distantly, the sound of Riley's voice still carrying the conversation she had left him to manage. He was in the van 60 seconds later. The van was moving within 90. The two men, she said as he settled into the front passenger seat. Advanced security for Hayes' retrieval team, Riley said. Arrived early. I told them I was conducting an authorized medical transfer and gave them a case number that will take them 40 minutes to trace as false. He looked in the side mirror at the hospital reseating behind them. We have 40 minutes. Naomi checked Jake's monitor. His pressure was lower than she wanted. She reached for the cooler and began setting up the first unit of packed cells, hands steady, eyes on the readout. Stay with me, she said to Jake. Still here, he said, his voice thinner than before, but present. Good. She adjusted the flow rate. Tell me about the compound. He talked while she worked. The compound was a decommissioned coastal training facility 2 hours south of the city, used by special operations units for water and breach training in the late 90s and early 2000s, and then handed over to a federal agency that had subsequently abandoned it. Chain link perimeter, 3 main structures, a dock on the south side. Harris had taken cover in the primary training building during the ambush, the first large structure inside the main gate. There's an equipment locker room off the main bay, Jake said. West wall. Harris always picked the same spot for field cache. Third locker from the left, back panel. She committed it to memory. She did not write it down. The van moved through the city and then out of it, the lights thinning as the highway carried them south. Naomi worked and watched the monitor and let the part of her mind that was not managing Jake's medical condition work through what came next. The safe house, the drive, the chain of evidence that connected everything. Hayes. She had trusted him. She kept working. The military rehabilitation center sat at the end of a gravel access road behind a stand of winterbear trees, looking exactly like what it was, a facility that had been significant once and had been left to the patience of weather and time. The main building was a long 2-story structure of utilitarian concrete, its windows intact but filmed with grime, its entrance secured with a padlock that Naomi opened on the first attempt with a code she had not thought about in 7 years and had not forgotten for a single day. The code was the date of the last successful mission. She had chosen herself. Inside, the building was cold and dark and smelled like abandonment, dust and old rubber flooring and the ghost of institutional cleaning products. Riley swept it with a flashlight while 2 of his people checked the perimeter. Naomi moved Jake to the medical recovery room on the ground floor, which still had its adjustable cot and equipment mounts and the wall-mounted oxygen connection that she verified was dry but structurally intact. She set up what she had and made it work. She always had. Brooks moved through the medical room with quick, assessing eyes, checking the setup Naomi had arranged, making small adjustments with the confidence of a surgeon who could adapt to field conditions, because she had never been too proud to learn from people who knew things she didn't. She said nothing critical, She was learning. Riley stood in the doorway watching Naomi work, and his expression was the one she had caught on his face in the hospital corridor. The particular quality of attention a person gives to something they have missed and not known quite how much until it returned. When Jake was stable and resting, Brooks stepped out to check the other rooms with one of Riley's people, and Naomi and Riley were briefly alone. "The others don't know this place exists," Riley said. "Not officially. It was classified under the recovery program that shut down in 2019, she said. The files went to archive. Nobody had reason to pull them. You remember the code. I remember everything from that time." She didn't look up from the monitor. "That's not a gift." He was quiet for a moment. Then, "For what it's worth, from the people who were there, from everyone who served with you, nobody believed the official report. Not for a day." She looked at him now. His face was serious and steady, and she could see that he meant it completely. "I know," she said. "That isn't what made it hard to carry." He nodded slowly. He understood the thing she hadn't said, that what had made it hard was not doubt about her own innocence, but the knowledge that her name had been used to close a chapter that deserved to stay open, and that 4 people had never come home because someone she trusted had sold them. "We'll get it right," he said. "Yes," she said. "We will." Brooks found her an hour later in the facility's old administrative office, sitting in front of a window that looked out on the dark tree line. Naomi heard her come in, but did not turn around. Brooks pulled up the other chair and sat. She was quiet for a moment, the companionable quiet of someone who has been through enough with a person in a short time to not need to fill the silence. Then she said, "Riley told me. About your command. About the mission." Naomi said nothing. "He told me you were considered one of the best special operations commanders the Navy had seen in 20 years, Brooks said. That your resignation shocked the entire military community. That nobody at your level believed the official account, but nobody was in a position to challenge it." She paused. "And that you took the blame voluntarily. To protect your people from an investigation that was designed to find someone guilty regardless of the truth." "Riley talks too much," Naomi said. "He talks exactly the right amount." Brooks folded her hands in her lap. "I came from a family where you kept your head down and you did the work and you didn't make noise about what was done to you because making noise cost more than it returned." She was quiet for a moment. "I learned eventually that there's a difference between choosing your battles and accepting a wrong, because fighting it is inconvenient for the people who benefited from it." Naomi turned to look at her. Brooks met her eyes. "You're going to have to let people do something about this. Not just a drive. Not just Hayes. You. Your name." Naomi studied her for a moment. Then she looked back at the window. "One thing at a time," she said. It was as close to agreement as she was going to come tonight, and Brooks seemed to understand that, because she nodded and let it rest. At just past 2 in the morning, headlights swept across the front of the facility. Riley was on his feet before the lights fully reached the window, and Naomi was 2 steps behind him, and the 2 of them were at the front entrance with the door cracked open and the lights inside cut before the vehicle had fully stopped on the gravel. A figure got out of the car alone. Young, medium build, moving quickly but not with the practiced caution of a threat. Moving with the purposeful anxiety of someone who has driven 2 hours in the dark to reach a place they weren't supposed to know about. Naomi stepped into the doorway. The figure stopped, looked up. The flashlight Riley was holding caught the face just long enough. Naomi exhaled. "Daniel," she said. Her younger brother crossed the gravel in 10 steps and stopped in front of her, and he looked at her with the expression of someone who has been frightened for a long time and has just found the thing they were frightened for. "I've been tracking you since the hospital," he said. "Not you specifically, the activity, the flag in the transfer system, the credential access logs, the footage scrub." He was slightly out of breath, the way people get when they've been running on adrenaline for too many hours in a row. "Naomi, I work in federal cyber analysis. I've been watching Hayes' financial trail for 14 months. She stared at him. "You've been? How long have you known? About Hayes?" "A year." "About what he did to your team?" Daniel pulled a breath. 2 months. I found the authorization signatures. The same ones Jake was tracking." He looked at Riley, then back at her. "I didn't know how to tell you. I didn't know if you were safe. I didn't know if my line was clean." His jaw tightened. "I should have found a way. I am sorry." Naomi looked at her brother, 29 years old, carrying 14 months of something he'd been holding alone, and she felt the particular complicated weight of family, which is the only weight that sits differently from all the others. "You're here now," she said. "Come inside." Daniel spread his materials across the administrative office's old desk. A laptop, 2 external drives, a folder of printed documents that he handled with the precision of someone who understood exactly how valuable they were. He had been with the Federal Cyber Analysis Division for 4 years. His work had initially been focused on contract fraud and defense procurement, routine, technically complex, unglamorous work that generated more paperwork than headlines. 14 months ago, a pattern in a procurement audit had pulled him sideways into something else. Authorization signatures that recurred across contracts at a frequency that wasn't statistically explainable by coincidence. Funds that moved in amounts and timing that matched no legitimate operational cycle. He had begun mapping it, carefully, quietly, telling no one. Hayes has been running the network through a shell layer inside the procurement division, Daniel said. He turned the laptop so Naomi and Riley could see the financial diagram he had built. The arms themselves move through a contractor that looks legitimate. Defense maintenance contracts, equipment supply, nothing that flags on a surface audit. But the payment cycles have a signature. Same window, same routing structure for 8 years. He pointed to a cluster of nodes on the diagram. "This cluster here, this is the period covering your mission." Naomi looked at it. The dates lined up exactly. "I found something 3 weeks ago that I haven't shared with my division yet," Daniel continued. He opened the second external drive and pulled up a scanned document. An internal communications thread from Hayes' office, 7 years old. Encrypted, but the encryption key was on a decommissioned server that got flagged during a routine archive sweep. He looked at Naomi. "It explicitly references your unit's deployment timeline, and it contains instructions to redirect the intelligence feed to a third party 24 hours before your mission went active." The room was very still. "He handed them to us," Riley said. His voice was flat and quiet in the way that meant he was controlling something that wanted to be much louder. "He handed them to you," Daniel said. "The documentation is complete on the financial side. What it doesn't have is the operational evidence, the specific communications linking Hayes to the attack itself, and the procurement records for the weapons that were used against your unit." He looked at Naomi. "Jake's drive would have that. If it exists." "It exists," Naomi said, "and we know where it is." Daniel looked at her. He had the particular expression of someone who had spent 14 months working alone on something and had just found out they weren't alone. "Then we can end this," he said. "Yes," Naomi said. She looked at Riley. "We go to the compound tomorrow night." She looked at Daniel. "You stay on the financial documentation. If anything happens to us, I publish it," Daniel said without hesitation. "Everything. All 14 months. Every signature, every routing number, every date." She held his gaze for a moment. He was her brother, and he was 29, and he had been carrying this alone for over a year, and she recognized in his face the same quality she had seen in her own reflection for 7 years. The particular set of a person who has decided that a wrong will be answered, regardless of what it costs. She recognized it because she had raised him to have it. "Good," she said. Jake's voice came from the medical room doorway. He was standing, barely, with one hand on the frame, and he had the expression of a man who had heard enough to insist on being vertical for the rest of the conversation. "I'm going to the compound," he said. Naomi turned. "You're 2 days out of surgery." "Harris was my point man," Jake said. "He hid that drive to protect me. I'm going." She looked at him. He looked back at her with the same expression she remembered from years ago, the particular stubbornness of genuine ability that has learned, finally, to be patient about everything except the things that matter most. "You ride in the van," she said. "You follow orders on the ground. If your body says stop, you stop." "Understood," he said. He almost meant it. Naomi looked around the room. Brooks, who had come to stand in the doorway of the administrative office. Riley, solid and certain. Daniel, with his months of quiet work spread out on the desk. Jake, upright against his own better medical interests. They were, collectively, what she had, which was more than she'd had before, which was enough. "Get some rest," she said. "All of you. We move at nightfall." She turned back to the window and the dark tree line and the gravel road that led back to the world they would have to walk back into very soon. Somewhere south of here, an abandoned compound waited in the dark with the evidence that could end a 7-year wrong. She had been away from command for 7 years. She was ready. They left the safe house at dusk. The van moved south through roads that thinned from highway to state route to a two-lane stretch of coastal asphalt that wound between scrub pine and marshland. The sky held the last gray light of a February evening for exactly long enough to feel it, and then the dark came down full and clean, and the only light was what the headlights made ahead of them. Naomi rode in the back with Jake. He had slept for most of the afternoon, which was the best thing his body could have done, and he'd eaten what Brooks put in front of him without complaint, which she took as a sign that he understood what was being asked of him tonight. His color was better than it had been. His pressure was holding in a range she could live with. He was not ready for this. He was going anyway, and she had made her terms clear, and he had accepted them, and that was the agreement they were operating under. Daniel was in the front passenger seat with his laptop balanced on his knees and a satellite uplink running through a secured line that he had spent 40 minutes establishing at the safe house. He had eyes on Hayes' known movements through federal monitoring channels he had access to that he was not, technically, authorized to use for this purpose. He had not mentioned this detail. Naomi had not asked. Riley drove. He had been quiet since they left, the particular quiet of a commander in the hours before an operation. Not withdrawal, not fear, but a gathering inward of everything that would need to be outward soon. Satellite shows the compound perimeter is clear, Daniel said without looking up. No vehicle signature on the access road. No thermal activity in the main structures. For now, Riley said. For now, Daniel agreed. Naomi looked out the small rear window at the dark road, unspooling behind them. She had been to this compound once, 8 years ago, during a joint training evaluation that had lasted 3 days and ended with a commendation she barely remembered. She remembered the terrain. She remembered the layout of the main building. She remembered the way the dock smelled at low tide and the sound the chain link made in a coastal wind. She had not expected to return. She had not expected a great many things that had happened in the past 4 days. 15 minutes, Riley said from the front. She put her hand briefly on Jake's forearm. He looked at her. She gave him the same small nod she had given him in the hospital room 4 nights ago, and he returned it with the same meaning, I understand. I'm ready. Let's finish this. They came in on foot from the north access point, leaving the van on a service road a quarter mile from the perimeter. The compound appeared through the tree line as a collection of shapes against the sky. The main building's flat roof line, the skeletal outline of the training tower, the chain-link fence running its long rectangle around all of it. The padlock on the north gate had been cut and replaced with a newer lock, which told Naomi 2 things: that someone had been here recently, and that Hayes had people who planned ahead. Riley cut the new lock with bolt cutters. The gate swung open without sound. They moved inside in the order they had agreed on. Riley's 2 people first, then Naomi and Jake, then Riley covering the rear. Daniel stayed at the van with the uplink. His job was the broadcast, and the broadcast was the point. The training compound's main building was a long rectangular structure with a central bay that had once served as an equipment staging area and now held only the ghosts of that function. Empty racks, a concrete floor marked with old painted zones, the smell of salt air and rust, and standing time. Their flashlights moved in careful arcs. Naomi tracked the west wall with her beam, counting the doorways from the entrance. The equipment locker room was the 3rd door. She went through it first. The room was maybe 30 feet long, lined on both sides with gray metal lockers, the kind that had been standard military supply for decades. Most of them stood open and empty. Some had been forced at some point. The west wall's lockers were intact, the latches corroded but not broken. She went to the 3rd from the left. The latch was stiff. It opened. Empty. She put her hand into the back of the locker and felt along the rear panel, pressing the corners, testing for give. Military cash work had a grammar she knew. You look for the seam, the spot where an inch of depth went unaccounted for, where the panel sat slightly proud of its mounting. Her fingers found it at the bottom right corner. A panel that moved. She pressed, and heard the soft release of a magnetic catch, and the panel swung inward, and behind it was a waterproof container roughly the size of a paperback book, sealed along its edge with the methodical care of someone who had done this knowing they might not be coming back for it. She pulled it free and held it. The room was very quiet. Jake appeared in the doorway. He looked at her hands. He looked at the container. Something moved across his face, relief and grief arriving together. The expression of a man who has been carrying a debt to a dead friend and has just found the chance to pay it. "Harris," he said quietly. "Harris," she agreed. She was handing the container to Jake when the lights came on. Not flashlights. The compound's emergency backup lighting, triggered from somewhere external, flooding the building in the flat, harsh illumination of a place that had been dark too long, suddenly forced awake. It turned the locker room white and shadowless, and gave them no cover and no ambiguity. From outside the building, she heard the sound of rotors. They moved out of the locker room fast, back into the main bay. Riley's people had already repositioned to the bay's two main entry points, and their faces said everything Naomi needed to know about what was happening outside. She went to the bay's high window and looked through it without showing her profile in the frame. A helicopter had set down on the compound's south clearing. Its running lights were still on. She counted 6 figures moving from it toward the main building, and in the middle of them, moving with the unhurried certainty of a man who had already decided how this ended, was Admiral Robert Hayes. He was older than the last time she had seen him. The years had turned his hair fully white and settled deeper lines into a face that had always carried a practiced authority. He was in civilian clothing, but he moved like a man in uniform because that was what decades of command did to a person. It became the body's language regardless of what the body was wearing. She stepped back from the window. 6+ Hayes, she said to Riley. Her voice was the voice she had not fully used in 7 years, the one that came from the place where training and experience had built something that did not rattle. His people will take the main entrance and the south side door. He'll want to come in through the center. He'll want to see the room first. The East Bay door has a bowl from inside, Riley said. Then we use the East Bay. She looked at Jake. You stay behind the cover line. You do not move forward regardless of what happens. You hold that container. Jake's jaw set. Naomi, that container is the only reason tonight matters, she said. You hold it. He held her gaze for a moment. Then he moved to the position she indicated. What followed in the next 4 minutes had the compressed, specific clarity of moments that exist outside normal time. Riley's people held the flanks. Naomi moved through the shadows of the main bay, using positions she remembered from the training evaluation 8 years ago, positions she had helped design as part of the exercise's defensive scenario, which meant she knew exactly where the sight lines failed and where cover was solid, and where a 6-person team coming through a main entrance would expect opposition and where they wouldn't. 2 of Hayes' people came through the south door and found Riley's personnel already positioned in the one angle the entrance didn't cover. They went down, not permanently, but functionally controlled takedowns that left them secured and out of the operation. 2 more came through the main entrance and found the same. That left Hayes and 1 remaining operative, who had entered separately through a side window with a specific intent of flanking, a tactic that would have worked against people who didn't know the building. Naomi stepped out of the shadow behind the operative before he completed the turn that would have let him see her, and she ended his part in the evening quietly and without ceremony. And then it was Hayes. He stood in the center of the main bay with a flashlight in one hand and the particular stillness of a man who has run out of the moves he planned and is now improvising from the bedrock of his character. His flashlight found her. "Commander Carter," he said. His voice was, as she remembered, measured, deep, carrying the automatic weight of someone accustomed to being obeyed. "I'd hoped we wouldn't get here. You had hoped I'd stayed quiet," she said. She walked toward him at a steady pace and stopped 15 feet away. "You've been hoping that for 7 years." He looked at her. There was something in his face that she hadn't expected and didn't particularly want, a genuine quality of regret. Not for what he had done, for the fact that it hadn't stayed buried. "Your unit had been in the wrong place," he said. "The operation your team stumbled into, you weren't supposed to be anywhere near that corridor. It was an accident of routing. 4 of my people died," she said. "That's not an accident. That's a consequence." The network was 10 years of work, Hayes said, and his voice carried the awful steadiness of a man explaining something he actually believed. The intelligence value of those operations protected assets you will never know about. Sometimes. Don't, she said. The word was quiet and flat, and it stopped him the way a wall stops a door. Don't tell me what their lives were worth. I knew them. Hayes looked at her for a long moment. Then his eyes moved past her shoulder, and she knew without turning that he had seen Jake. The drive, Hayes said. Already transmitted, said a voice from the building's east entrance. Daniel stepped inside, his laptop under his arm, his expression carrying the calm of someone who has just done the thing they spent 14 months preparing to do. He looked at Hayes the way people look at something they have studied closely for a very long time and are finally seeing in person. The contents of the encrypted drive have been broadcasting to the Military Investigations Directorate, the Federal Procurement Oversight Office, and 2 independent journalists for the past 6 minutes, Daniel said. The financial documentation from my own analysis went with it. He paused. It's done. Hayes stood in the center of the bay, and the flashlight in his hand lowered slowly. And Naomi watched the moment when a man understands that the thing he built over a decade is gone. It was not a dramatic moment. It was a quiet one, the quiet of something large and rotten finally falling. It didn't have to be you, Hayes said to Naomi. His voice had lost its authority. What was left was older and smaller and tired. You were supposed to have a career. You were supposed to. I was supposed to bring my team home, she said. You made sure I couldn't. She held his gaze until he looked away. When Riley's people secured Hayes and led him out to wait for the federal vehicles that Daniel had already called in, Naomi stood alone in the center of the bay for a moment. The emergency lights hummed. The compound smelled like salt and rust and old concrete. Outside, the rotors of Hayes' helicopter had gone still. Jake appeared beside her. He was holding the waterproof container against his chest with both arms, and he looked at her with the expression she had seen on him in the ICU 4 nights ago. Relief and pain arriving together. The face of someone who has carried something a long way and has finally put it down in the right place. Thank you, he said. For Harris. For all of them. She looked at him. Thank Harris, she said. He's the one who made sure it survived. She put her hand briefly on his good shoulder. Then she walked toward the exit, and the night air came in through the open bay door, cold and clean off the water, and she stood in it and breathed. It was done. 6 weeks passed. They passed the way the aftermath of large things always passes. Not quickly, not cleanly, but with the grinding forward motion of institutional machinery that had been set in motion and could not now be stopped. Committees convened. Investigators filed reports. Attorneys general issued statements. The story moved through news cycles and waves, each wave larger than the one before it, as the full scope of what Daniel's documentation and Jake's encrypted drive had revealed became impossible to contain or minimize. Admiral Robert Hayes was arrested 17 days after the compound. He was charged with treason, conspiracy to commit murder, arms trafficking, and the wrongful deaths of 4 United States Navy Special Operations personnel. The list of charges ran to 11 pages. He made no public statement. The military tribunal convened 5 weeks after his arrest in a proceeding that was formal and closed, and that Naomi was asked to attend but did not have to testify at unless she chose to. She chose to. She sat in the tribunal chamber in civilian clothes and answered every question put to her in the same flat, precise voice she had used in operational briefings a decade ago, and she did not look at Hayes once during the 4 hours she was in that room. The tribunal's findings, when they came, were unambiguous. Commander Naomi Carter had been wrongfully blamed for the failure of a mission that had been deliberately sabotaged by a superior officer. Her resignation had been induced under false pretenses. Her service record would be officially corrected. Every reference to command failure in connection with the operation of 7 years ago would be expunged and replaced with a formal commendation for the lives she had preserved during the extraction under active hostile fire. The Navy's senior leadership issued a public statement. Naomi read it once, in the apartment she had lived in for 4 years, sitting at the kitchen table with her coffee going cold the way it always did when she sat down with the intention of drinking it and got distracted by thinking. The statement used words like regret and acknowledge and honor. She read it twice and then set it face down on the table. Words were words. She had learned a long time ago that what mattered was what people did. Jake's testimony came on a Thursday. He sat before the tribunal in his dress uniform, his left arm still in a partial support brace that would come off in another 3 weeks, and he spoke for 2 hours. His voice was steady throughout. He described the mission, the network, the evidence trail that led to Hayes. And then the tribunal's lead investigator asked him to speak to Commander Carter's service record as her subordinate, and Jake's voice shifted into something different. Not less composed, but more deliberate, carrying the weight of something he had been waiting a long time to say in a room that was capable of hearing it. He described 9 missions conducted under her command. He described the decisions she had made and the way she had made them. Not recklessly, not from ego, but from a systematic and thorough reading of conditions that had brought every person in her unit home. Every time, until the 10th mission, when the conditions had been falsified by someone with the authority to falsify them. He described the extraction under fire, the wounded she had carried, the choices she had made in the moments when the operation collapsed, the choices that had kept the survivors alive. He said, "She was the best commander I served under. She is the best commander I have known. And this institution failed her in the way institutions fail the people who give them the most, by deciding that her reputation was a more convenient sacrifice than the truth." The room was quiet when he finished. The lead investigator noted the statement for the record without comment, which was the most formal version of having nothing left to say. Dr. Victor Langford watched the news coverage on a Thursday evening in the attending physician's lounge at Mercy General Hospital. The segment ran 4 minutes, a summary of the tribunal's findings, a brief biography of Naomi Carter's military service, a clip from Jake's testimony that the network had cleared for public broadcast. Langford sat with his coffee cup halfway to his mouth for the first 30 seconds and then set it down and watched the rest of it without moving. He thought about a woman in scrubs standing at a scrub sink, calmly explaining a subhepatic bleed to a surgical team that hadn't found it yet. He thought about a man in a hospital corridor bringing his hand to his forehead in a salute. He thought about the chart he had reviewed after the surgery, the intervention notes, the clinical observations, the precise and accurate and completely correct assessment of wound patterns that had saved a patient's life before anyone else in that or understood what they were looking at. He sat in a lounge for a long time after the segment ended. He was not a man who found humility easily, but he was underneath the arrogance and the performance of it, a man who understood medicine, and understanding medicine meant understanding when you had been wrong about something important. He was wrong about Naomi Carter. He had been wrong about her from the first day. Jake came to the hospital on a Friday morning 3 weeks after the tribunal. He came in through the main entrance in civilian clothes, his left arm free of the brace now, moving with the careful but improving ease of a body that was finding its way back to itself. He stopped at the information desk and asked for Naomi Carter by name. The volunteer at the desk looked up and said she was on the trauma floor, day shift, and could she let Naomi know he was coming? "No," he said. "I'd rather surprise her." He took the elevator to the trauma floor and stepped out into the controlled noise of a working hospital morning. Monitors, footsteps, the overlapping frequencies of a place that did not pause. He asked a passing nurse where he might find Naomi, and the nurse pointed toward the far end of the hall. She was at the nurse's station, standing with a chart in her hand, talking to one of the younger nurses about a patient's medication interaction. She was in her scrubs. Her reading glasses were pushed up on her forehead. She looked exactly as she had always looked in this building, composed, precise, present. She looked up. She saw him. Something moved across her face that she didn't bother controlling, a brief, full warmth that she usually kept behind the professional surface, visible for exactly the moment it took her to cross the distance between them. She stopped 3 feet away. He stood straight. His right hand came up, clean and formal, and he held the salute. Around him, the trauma floor had gone quiet. Nurses had stopped. Residents stood still. The charge nurse at the station looked up from her computer. Even Langford, who had appeared from the direction of Bay 3 with a chart under his arm, stopped walking and stood. Jake held the salute. Naomi looked at him. She looked at the room around her, the people who had dismissed her, and the people who had wondered, and the people who had known something was different about her and hadn't known what to do with the knowledge. She looked at Petra, the young nurse who had whispered that Langford was going to hate her, standing with both hands pressed to her mouth. She returned the salute. It was not a long moment, but it was a complete one, the kind that does not require extension because it contains everything that needed to be said inside itself. She lowered her hand. So did he. How's the shoulder? She said. Good enough, he said. You did solid work. The surgical team did solid work. You know what I mean? She didn't know. She let herself accept it, which was the thing Brooks had told her she needed to learn to do and which did not come naturally and which she was working on. The Navy's offer arrived the following week, delivered in an official envelope that sat on Naomi's kitchen table for 2 days before she opened it. Reinstatement at the rank of commander, with an expedited review pathway to captain. Full restoration of benefits and service continuity. A position in Special Operations Medical Oversight that would have her working across branches, writing the doctrine that would govern battlefield medicine training for the next decade. She read it twice. She thought about it for 3 days. She called Jake on the 4th day. I'm not taking it, she said. A pause. Okay, he said. I'm not going back to active command structure. I've thought about it, and I know what I would be returning to, and I know what it would cost. What are you going to do? She looked out her apartment window. Baltimore in early spring. The first suggestion of green at the edges of things. The sky a cleaner blue than February allowed. There's a proposal on the table to create a civilian specialist track for Special Operations medical training, she said. Civilian instructors with operational backgrounds working directly with SEAL medical units. No rank, no chain of command. Just the work. Training the next generation, Jake said. Training the next generation, she agreed. He was quiet for a moment. Harris would have liked that, he said. She felt the particular weight of the name. Not the crushing weight it had been for 7 years, but something different. Something that could be carried. The weight of a person who had mattered and still mattered, and whose absence was a permanent fact that did not have to be a wound. Yes, she said. He would have. She went back to work on a Monday. She came in through the main entrance the way she always had, with her bag over one shoulder and her coffee in her hand and her reading glasses already on top of her head. She took the elevator to the trauma floor. She clocked in at the nurse's station and reviewed the overnight notes and began her shift. The staff around her moved with the morning rhythm of the floor, the overlapping motion and sound of a place that did not stop. Some of them greeted her the way they always had. Some greeted her differently now, with a quality of attention that was not the attention of people seeing someone for the first time, but people seeing someone they had always been looking at, finally understanding what they were looking at. Langford passed her in the hall at 8:15. He stopped. She waited. Carter, he said. He seemed to be working on something internally, some rearrangement of himself that did not come easily. Dr. Langford, she said. You were right, he said. About the bleed. About the wound pattern. He paused. About a number of things. I know, she said. He nodded once, the nod of a man who had said the thing he needed to say and was not going to elaborate on it. He walked on. She watched him go. Then she picked up her chart and walked down the hall and through the trauma floor, past Petra, the medication cart, past the young residents who moved aside with a respect that was nothing like what she had been given when she arrived, past the bay windows and the morning light coming through them, and the working noise of a place that helped people survive things that should have killed them. The floor did not pause for her. It kept its rhythm, as it always had. She kept hers alongside it. She was a trauma nurse. She had also been a commander and a soldier, and a woman who had carried a wrong for 7 years in silence, and who had come to the end of that silence not with noise, but with the same quiet precision she brought to everything she did. The staff knew now. They had always been standing beside her. How many people do we overlook every day simply because of the uniform they're wearing, never once asking what they had to sacrifice to get there? If this story hit you, like and subscribe. There are more where this came from.